hooves, 2 horns, and a ton of thundering meat. Whether you choose to call them buffalo or bison, they are impressive animals. The plan to kill more than 4,000 of them in a national park was bound to cause an uproar. Government experts say they're sick, that there's nothing we can do to cure them, that the only solution is to slaughter the lot of them and start building a new herd from scratch.
They lie to convince people to believe that this buffalo must be killed off.
There is no place for helicopter gunships in this part of the world.
For more than a year and a half, ever since they first heard about the bison slaughter plan, residents of northern Canada have been fuming. Finally, they got a chance to tell government officials what they thought of the idea.
By eradicating the bison, you are condemning the Dene Métis way of life in the Northwest Territories.
Wood Buffalo National Park is considered a World Heritage Site largely because of the bison. This is the largest herd of wild, free-roaming bison in the world. But one government official estimates that nearly half the herd is infected with tuberculosis and brucellosis. They got the diseases from contact with domestic cattle. At a recent public hearing in Fort Smith, a veterinarian from Agriculture Canada, Dr. William Bulmer, tried to explain why he thinks it's necessary to destroy the herd in order to save it.
And Agriculture Canada pretty well insists on the need to eliminate the diseases. We've had 70 to 80 years experience in dealing with these diseases. We have depopulated well over 1,000 cattle herds, some of them with a single animal infected. But that policy has enabled us to remove these 2 diseases from 160,000 cattle herds across the country.
People came to the hearings in Fort Smith with loaded questions. They wanted to know why, if these animals had existed with the disease for more than 60 years, there was such a hurry to kill them now. They wanted to know how many of the animals were actually sick and how the scientists knew that for sure. They wanted to know why it was important to kill the entire herd if only some of them were diseased. Agriculture Canada knew that their program would not be popular, but they stuck to their guns and insisted that killing the entire herd was the only solution. This is not the first time that killing off the buffalo has been on the public agenda. In the early 1800s, as American settlers began moving west across the Great Plains, nearly 60 million buffalo were simply in the way. By 1885, the plains bison was nearly extinct. Some say as few as 50 were left alive. Carcasses and huge piles of bones were strewn across the prairies. But then, a remarkable twist of fate in the Flathead Valley of Montana. A handful of bison, saved and protected by an Indian rancher, grew and multiplied so successfully they ran out of grazing land. The owners, Charles Allard and Michel Pablo, asked the U.S. government to either buy the herd or set aside some land as a buffalo reserve. No deal. Congress wanted to open the area to cattle ranching. They sent Pablo an eviction notice and offered him a low bid for the animals. Pablo was so incensed he crossed the border and cut a deal with the Canadian government instead. Howard Douglas, the Dominion Commissioner of Parks, accurately predicted that Americans would be furious when they heard about the deal. And so in 1907, the wild, unruly bison were rounded up on the Flathead Indian Reserve, corralled, kicking and bucking and snorting into cattle cars, and Canadian officials made plans to move the herd north from Montana, far enough north across the border that angry Americans would not be tempted to rustle them back home. In Canada, crowds of people from Edmonton turned out to watch the unloading. Over a 5-year period, 716 plains bison from the Pablo herd were delivered to the newly created Buffalo National Park in Wainwright, Alberta. Over the next decade, the herd became world famous. Hollywood film crews came up to shoot movies. And government researchers conducted crossbreeding experiments with cattle. That's where the disease problem began. Domestic cattle gave tuberculosis and brucellosis to the bison, and the sickness has been in the herd ever since. Dr. Valerius Geist is a professor of environmental sciences and biology at the University of Calgary.
I must say that I have a certain amount of sympathy with Maxwell Graham, who was the man in charge of the operation, because he was really in an impossible situation. He was dealing with a problem of success. And the success was that the bison, which were brought to that area to multiply, did exactly that. They multiplied and multiplied and multiplied.
Back from the brink of extinction.
Back from the brink of extinction, the Pablo herd went to it. And the net result was they were already then diseased. And so he had to deal with the diseased overpopulation. What could he do? Public opinion would hardly allow him to shoot several thousand buffaloes a year and leave them to rot. He had to get them out of the way somehow.
So what he did was
get rid of them by shipping the problem north.
In 1926, the herd was rounded up again, forced into pens and eventually onto trains for a long trip north to the edge of the Alberta wilderness, where an area the size of Switzerland became the new Wood Buffalo National Park. It is the descendants of the Pablo herd that Agriculture Canada wants to slaughter now. As the domestic cattle industry moves slowly north in search of greener pastures, unfenced open rangeland, there's always the risk of a chance encounter. Hypothetically, a bison wanders out of this park and the cattle are reinfected.
We now, of course, have been declared free of the disease, and we're very proud of that fact, and I think cattlemen are proud and the country is proud.
Chris Mills is a policy advisor to the Alberta Cattle Commission.
One of the real problems we have is that now we have got rid of the disease within our domestic cattle, they are all very, very susceptible to the disease. It's just like having a whole bunch of people that are no longer exposed to measles. If measles ever gets out there, everybody gets it. If the disease ever got out of the park, we would be very, very susceptible. Thousands of cattle could become infected in a very short time.
The disease-free status of Canada's cattle herds is, however, debatable. Scientists don't agree about whether TB or brucellosis is ever really wiped out. These cattle are classified disease-free, but is the sickness gone forever? Or is it merely dormant? Professor Valerius Geist.
Our so-called disease-free status is not an absolute disease-free status of our cattle herds. It's a relative disease-free status. That means these diseases continue to crop up periodically in Canada, as they do in the United States, where for 55 years attempts have been made to eradicate them. If you cannot eradicate these diseases absolutely in domestic cattle, how do you want to do that with wild cattle?
Well, with great difficulty. Several years ago, government veterinarians tried to round them up, to inoculate them. They used helicopters to chase them into big corrals. But just watch what happens when you try to inoculate a herd of wild bison. As the National Film Board showed in 1985, capturing and injecting these animals was a horrendous undertaking. A vaccination program just won't work, according to Dr. Stacy Tessero of Agriculture Canada.
In 100 years of disease research, we still have not found any vaccine that's entirely effective, and we've not found any means of treating animals that's effective. And that's the unfortunate fix that we're in. I guess my opinion as a veterinarian is that I can't do anything for this herd. I'd love to. I mean, we always like the magic bullet, you know, some method of treatment.
If Agriculture Canada gets its way, healthy young animals from this herd would replace the sick animals killed up north. This is Elk Island National Park, a wildlife sanctuary about 30 minutes drive east of Edmonton. The interesting thing is that a little more than 20 years ago, this herd was diseased as well. What they did was take the calves away from their mothers and bottle feed them so they wouldn't pick up diseases from mother's milk. After giving birth, the mothers were slaughtered. It took 10 years and several generations, but they eliminated all detectable traces of TB and brucellosis. Theoretically, at least, a diseased herd became a healthy herd. So on the one hand, you could argue that it is possible to eradicate the disease without killing all the animals. But on the other hand, all the original members of this herd from 20 years ago are in fact dead now. So in that sense, what happened here sounds a lot like what Agriculture Canada is proposing to do up north. Experts also disagree about genetics. Agriculture Canada wants to generate the new herd from animals here at Elk Island because these are considered purebreds, purebred wood bison. The animals up north are a cross between wood bison and the plains bison brought up from Montana. The wild herd at Wood Buffalo Park is referred to officially as diseased hybrids. In essence, a bunch of mongrels that ought to be replaced. But Professor Geist at the University of Calgary says killing the hybrids would be a tragic mistake.
The hybrids are the most valuable bison we have.
Why?
Because they are the carriers of the full genetic potential that is left for that species.
It represents the largest wildlife disease eradication program ever proposed in North America.
Scientists disagree, and now two different agencies of the federal government disagree as well. Agriculture Canada wants to kill the park bison, but Parks Canada says, wait, hold on a second. Ken East is superintendent at Wood Buffalo National Park.
No, I don't think the Park Service agrees with that. Environment Canada doesn't agree with that, and certainly the staff that work in Wood Buffalo National Park don't agree with that. This park is a World Heritage Site. This park is essentially the cradle of bison recovery in Canada. The proposal of Agriculture Canada, as it now stands, has a number of fairly serious deficiencies.
The people who live nearest the park would be the ones most directly affected by a bison slaughter. Fort Smith is primarily a community of Métis and Native Indian people who depend on wildlife for their survival.
This is a very, very major event in the Northwest Territories, considering the eradication, or in your words, the replacement, in my words, the slaughter of all the buffalo in the area, all the buffalo, period.
All through the hearings, various Native leaders peppered government officials with hard questions about how the bison slaughter would affect them. In the end, they promised a lawsuit if the government even tries to slaughter the buffalo.
We've paid our dues to have...
The mayor of Fort Smith, Dennis Bevington, summed up the community's feelings this way.
This is 1990. This is the age of environment. This is the age of concern over wildlife. This is not the days when you could send an expert up from Ottawa and he could get away with whatever he wanted to in Fort Smith and with the bison herd of this area. This is 1990. The eyes of the world will be on this project, and they are very critical eyes.
Frank Laviolette, one of the local elders, says the Dene Métis people simply cannot live without the bison.
I have a big family with 8 daughters and 3 sons, and pretty well all raised on bison meat. And I can surely and clearly approve that 90% of the wild meat we use in this community is bison.
You couldn't live without the bison?
Couldn't.
They are concerned that they're going to lose the bison, they're going to lose a way of life, they're not going to be able to do what they used to be able to do. We can understand that entirely, because many thousands of cattlemen have done exactly that. The only point we make is that there's really not much difference between cattlemen and Indians. We went through it, and we don't want to go through it again, and unfortunately, in order to make sure that doesn't happen, the Indians are going to have to go through it.
They're going to have to lose the bison herd.
They're going to have to lose the bison herd temporarily, just as many cattlemen lost their herds temporarily.
Hunted by man to the edge of extinction, the bison made a spectacular comeback. Then they got sick because of man-made experiments, crossbreeding with cattle. And now government experts think the only way to undo these man-made mistakes is to slaughter the herd and start again. 10 years and $20 million would solve the problem, they say. 2 federal cabinet ministers make the judgment call sometime this spring. But Native leaders say they simply won't allow what they call a buffalo holocaust in a World Heritage Site. For the Journal, this is Jerry Thompson at Wood Buffalo National Park.
In a moment, David Gilmour on actor Dennis Hopper. From Easy